this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll explain how to approach adding cables to a stockinette project. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. So this is a plain stockinette hat, and it has a ribbed border, which is pretty common in any stockinette project, that you have some kind of a border. It might be ribbing, or it might be seed stitch or garter stitch, something like that, to prevent the stockinette portion from rolling. This is the kind of project where knitters are often asking, well, how can I add cables to this project? And the reason that they're asking this is because they understand that cables will cause the fabric to pull in. So these 3 swatches were all knit using 20 stitches. And you can see that the stockinette swatch is quite a bit wider than this cabled swatch, and it's quite a bit wider than this one as well. So you need more stitches when you're working cables in order to end up with fabric that's the same width as it would be if it were in stockinette. So let me just show you a basic example of how this works. Let's say you had a rectangle like this, and you had some ribbing here, and it was 10 inches wide, and you're working at 5 stitches per inch. So you have 50 stitches. In this kind of a scenario, typically you will cast on the number of stitches that you want for your stockinette. So you'd cast on 50 stitches, you work in your ribbing, and then when it was time to work in the stockinette portion, you just switch to working in stockinette. Now for ribbing is going to pull in, and that's usually something that's desirable if you want ribbing. But in something where you want everything to be completely flat, you might be working this in seed stitch or garter stitch or something like that. But again, you'd be casting on the number of stitches that you actually wanted for the stockinette portion. But let's say you wanted to add a cable that looked like this up the center of that particular fabric. So you wanted to have a cable panel that came right here like this. In order to have this still be 10 inches wide, you're going to need more stitches because this cable, as we saw, pulls in. So what you do is you swatch for both the stockinette, or if you have a different kind of filler stitch in the background, you have to swatch for whatever your plain stitch pattern is, and you have to swatch your actual cable pattern. And since this cable pattern is a specific number of stitches wide, you don't calculate stitches per inch with this cable. You actually just measure how wide is this actual cable. So if I was going to actually use this particular cable in a project, in order to get an accurate measurement of how wide the actual cable itself is, I would, or I should have included more stitches along the side here so that I could accurately measure the complete cable as well as the purl columns next to it. And then what you do is you measure the widest part of the cable. You don't measure where the crossings occur, you measure across where the widest occurs. And I would want to include the purl column as well. So for this particular cable, let's say that the cable and the purl column next to it is 2.75 inches wide, and it's made up of 18 stitches. Again, we're not figuring out the stitches per inch for this particular cable. We needed to know how wide it actually is. What we're going to do is replace the stockinette stitches that would have been in this section and that would have been 2.75 inches wide, and we're going to replace them with the stitches that form the cable that's 2.7 inches wide. So my stockinette gauge was 5 stitches per inch. So 2.75 stitches of stockinette is 13.75 stitches, which is not a whole number. So we'll say it's 14 stitches. So what that means is that in this place that is 2.7 inches wide, I will have 14 stitches spanning that area that I will increase to 18 stitches. So I started out with 50 stitches, And when I'm transitioning to the ribbing and I get to this point right here where I'm working these 14 stitches, I'm going to work 4 increases right here to increase to the 18 stitches. And you want to you don't want to increase evenly across the row, because the place where the extra stitches are needed are at the base of this particular cable. By adding 4 stitches, I'm actually going to have 54 stitches for the body of this particular thing that's going to end up being 10 inches wide. I start out with the 50 stitches that I would have had if this was all stockinette, and then I work my 4 increases right here to prepare myself for this cable. What you don't want to do is calculate how wide and how many stitches you want for your cabled area and then cast on that number. So I don't want to say, oh, I need 54 stitches for this particular section, so I'm just going to cast on 54 stitches, because what's going to happen is this is going to be too big, especially if it's something like a hat, it'll end up being too loose. And if you're using a border pattern like seed stitch, if you cast on the number of stitches that you need for the cabled area, but you cast on for it down here, what you get is what's called cable flare, and you get this ruffled fabric right here. Instead, since you end up with something that's this wide, you need to know, well, how many seed stitches are in something that's this wide, so that you cast on the correct number of stitches for the beginning border, and then you work your increases, and then you can work your cables. And then in this case, where we change back to a border, we would then do decreases so that, again, we don't get that ruffly edge. So this is called cable flare, and that's why you have to do increases to prepare for the cabled section, and you don't just cast on the number that you need for the cabled section at the beginning. Now, in a situation where you truly only want to add 1 cable and it's something really narrow like that, like maybe you just want to put 1 cable up the side of your sock, you can kind of fudge this. You could just add a couple of extra stitches when you're transitioning from the ribbing to the cable, and you put those extra stitches at the base of this cable, and that is going to be close enough. And that is only if you're adding 1 narrow cable that's composed of just a few stitches. Otherwise, you really should swatch. If you are planning on making something that has a lot of different cables, like say an Aran sweater, then you are going to swatch your center panel, and you're going to swatch all the different cables that you are going to have going out to one side of it, plus your filler stitch. You can then measure this portion and know how wide it's going to be on the other side of that center panel. And once you know the actual measurement of the part that's all cabled, then you can use the actual stitch gauge of your filler stitch to determine, well, how many stitches do I actually need of my filler stitch on each side. Because cables can be made up of any number of stitches, and there can be any number of crossings in a crossing row, there's just no way to reliably predict how much any particular cable is going to pull in. The last thing that you need to consider is not only that cables will pull in, but that they don't stretch as much horizontally. These 2 swatches, which this is ribbing and this is our cables, they are pulling in just about the same amount because of the way that knits and purls columns interact with each other. But ribbing will stretch horizontally just as much as stockinette will. While that is not true for cables, that you have this resistance to stretching because of those cable crossings. And what that means is that you need to consider the amount of ease that you have in the item that you are adding cables to. So for a sweater that is meant to have positive ease, which means you're knitting it to be a little bit bigger than the largest circumference, body part that it's surrounding, if you're knitting something with positive ease or no ease, so that it's exactly the same size as the body part, you can add your cables and you can plan it to be the same width as it would have been in stockinette. But if you are knitting something that has negative ease, and that means that you're knitting it to be smaller in circumference than the body part it's surrounding, and that would be something like socks or a hat, Those items are typically knit with 10% negative ease so that they're smaller and then that they stretch to fit the item. Cables are not going to stretch as much as stockinette will. And so if you're knitting something that's smaller in circumference and you're using cables around the entire circumference of that item, you will probably want it to be a little bit bigger than it was if it were in stockinette. So this hat, for example, has 10% negative ease. If I was going to replace the stockinette with nothing but cables, I would knit it to have maybe 5% negative ease rather than 10% negative ease, because it's just going to really resist stretching and it's going to maybe feel too snug. Cables are a great addition to any knitting project because they make the knitting process more enjoyable and produce a more interesting finished item. If you are interested in learning more about the ins and outs of cables, you may want to check out this playlist of cable-related videos here. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.